Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Julia Mallot. Julia is a trans woman. She's also been writing for the National Post. She has a website where she discusses issues around trans, I guess, overreach, one way or the other. And she recently had an article in the National Post about what she considers is overreach from the Conservative Party in their new proposed policies after the convention. Hey Julia, thank you for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, okay, I mean, I was following you on Twitter on my old account, then I got banished. Now I'm following you
I
on my
heard
new.
about that.
Yeah. Oh, whatever. I don't want to get into that. It was just silly. But anyways, so like I've seen how you've been, like how you've been talking about this issue. But if you want to give people like a brief introduction, who you are, how you got started, why you thought you had to speak out against some of the stuff that's going on right now, and all your concern, then we can get into your article and your concerns and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Julia. I am transgender, and I am also a parent. I have a daughter, an adopted daughter, who is in her grade 12 year right now. And for me, that has been formative to landing where I am now. I certainly believe in transgender rights. I certainly believe in the importance of individual expression. And I understand gender dysphoria because this is how I've always felt. And so I do have a passion and I have empathy for so many individuals who struggle in our society, which is very gendered and has, still a rigidity that I don't think we always fully acknowledge. And but that being said, after a few years of my transition, and once my daughter was moving into a large kind of big city high school, I started to see the identity side of what's going on as well. When I was a kid 20 plus years ago, these matters were never discussed. I felt gender dysphoric and there were no supports. This was never once mentioned in my school. This was never once mentioned in the healthcare system. And I don't think that was a good thing because when I eventually found blogs and stuff that helped me understand how I felt, I associated that with a lot of shame because I didn't think this was something I could talk about. I certainly didn't think that this was something I could approach an adult about. And so I sat with that for a long time, and it caused a lot of negative mental health situations for my teenage and early adult years. But what I observed with my daughter is we've kind of recognized that problem, and we have swung the other way to the point that LGBT identities are celebrated and glamorized to an extent that it's almost a given that some kids are going to adopt this because they're looking for a place to fit in. They're looking for a way to be unique, special. They're looking for a community, and this is a powerful community that is exposed to them in the education system. My daughter last week made an observation to me, which is she can get free counseling if she was LGBT at school, but she can't get free counseling because she's not LGBT. And it's like when you start to create a situation like this, to me, it's a no-brainer that you're going to have some people who fall into this space for reasons other than gender dysphoria. And I'm divided on my feelings towards that. In one sense, I think that people should explore. I think that it's not the job of the state, certainly not the job of me to broker what somebody can do, how somebody can identify. But at the same time, having been through a social, a hormonal, and a surgical transition myself, I understand the weight of what's involved, the medical risk, the financial implications, the stigmatization, a lot of reasons that I'm so thankful that I live in a country where this is available for people with severe dysphoria, for people who this has been the only way that they can find to cope and to thrive. But observing now in the schools is a culture of people falling into this and making decisions that they may regret. I know people who have had hormonal or surgical transitions that they regret, and that terrifies me for them because I don't want to see people go down a path like that that's irreversible and regret where they're at. And it also terrifies me because what I've noticed over the last few years is that provides a lot of fodder to people who do have true anti-transgender sentiments to point to and say this is why we need to ban you know, all transgender space in our societies. So it was kind of those two competing pulls that I've seen in our political system that kind of brought me into the space. I am transgender. I have fairly centrist, slightly conservative leaning political views. And that's put me in a unique space to be able to really have conversations with individuals on both of these sides to say, how do we find a middle ground in a place that champions parental rights, that champions individual autonomy for both sides, rather than just looking at the transgender rights side of it or just looking at some of the more traditional conservative sides of the equation.
All right, well, cool, thanks. Okay, just a couple of things on that. Then I guess I would like to get to your article, just because, again, here I think I agree with pretty much everything you've just said, and it just be like kind of nitpicking to point stuff out. But okay, like okay, the way I'm seeing this, and again, I didn't really get into. I mean, I was on the periphery of it, and I saw what was going on in some schools, but I wasn't paying it as much attention as I was paying to the race stuff, because that was really something that was, you know, I mean, the whole reason I got into any kind of culture war stuff was because I was called a white supremacist for criticizing Islam, and I'm like, I'm brown, and I'm just like, okay, where does that come from? And so I just kind of looked into that, and then, like I said, the gender stuff was on the periphery of it, but then I started looking to it recently, and it just, for me, like, something you mentioned, like, so when I read that there was a 4,000% increase in young girls transitioning, I'm like, okay, even if you say that before they weren't accepted, so not as many were coming out, but I'm like, a 4,000% increase is a lot. And then, even with that, I have to put the caveat that you have to look at the numbers. A 4,000% increase, you know, is, when you started off with something that was less than a 4,000% increase isn't, it's not like 25% of the population or anything like that, but still, that's a huge jump to have. So, like, so there's some, like, some what you mentioned. So that concerns me. Yes, there might be, like, I shouldn't say there might be, because I'm sure there were always children with dysphoria, but I don't think it started pre-puberty. I think some of that would probably start after puberty. That's a guess on my part. Like, I have no basis for making that guess, but I'm just assuming that, you know until your body starts changing, and until you're getting all your, like, the hormones you're supposed to be getting, and you're going into, like, the way you're basically born biologically, then I think that's when it would maybe more kick in than before. I don't know, though. Like, I could be wrong about that. Um, but my concern too now is, our systems are so corrupted that, if a kid who was like, if you don't know, if a child's doing it because they want to be cool or because they're genuinely dysphoric, the way our system is set up, like, I'm concerned about how the the therapists and the psychologists, like, and especially like in Canada, where you can only have affirming only care. I'm like, okay, yeah, fine, you're going seeing a quote unquote specialist, but how are they looking at this, right? So for me, it's like, yeah, I want people to get the treatment they need. I want people to feel good. I want people to, you know, uh, be healthy and be able to live their lives to the fullest. But if we also have to recognize that our system is broken, and we need a better way to judge this. And so, like I said, I agree with most of what you're saying, but those are my concerns. And that's like, if you're an adult, I don't want to stop you from, aside from if you're going to harm someone else, like, like, I don't want to stop you, but, do what you want. When it comes to children, and I'm not a parent, and obviously these aren't my children, but at the same point, it's like, okay, as a society, we have to protect those that are innocent. And, you know, that's where my concerns come in from. Like, that's my biggest focus on this. When we get into the adults, we can talk about spaces for women, as opposed to, like prisons, and I think sport is a big one. Um, but then, a washroom and a bar, like, how do you want to go there? Like, like, we can figure that out. But, like, but yeah, I'm more focused on the children, because I think that's something we have to really look at. So, if you want to say anything about that, go ahead. Or if you want to talk about your article, and, like, why you thought you wanted to write it, and where you, like, give your stance on that, and then, like I said, I'll give you my opinion on those things, and we can take the discussion from there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as far as the children go, I agree with you. I think one of the areas where I disagree with the approach that's being taken in Canada right now is fixating on transgender matters from the identity side of it. That's the narrative we have. That's how the laws are structured, is to say everyone is entitled to their own identity, and that can't be challenged. That shouldn't be something that is is questioned. And therapists are scared, therefore, to explore it because they might be labeled as trying to convert or trying to dissuade someone from exploring this identity. I I think that's a profoundly unhelpful way to look at the transgender experience because whether we want to admit it or not, something is wrong with me, with Julia. I am biologically male, and that caused me deep distress. There's a lot of people debating why that causes me deep distress, the extent to which that is physiological, the extent to which that is genetic, the extent to which that is purely, psychosocial. And we could debate that forever. I have no idea the answer, but what we do know is that I experienced that from a very young age. It never went away. And because of that, transition has been the best way for me to cope, has been the best way for me to thrive, and has been the best way for me to continue to exist and exist in a positive way for myself within society. But all of that being said, I do not believe that transition is a better path than not transitioning when the other option is available. There's still something wrong with me that makes me feel this way. If there's a kid who could transition or they could not transition and they could be happy either way, I would strongly say they should not transition. This is not something that they should do just because. My partner has chronic illness. And because of that, there's a lot of things that she can't do. She has to get a ton of sleep. And much of her day is focused on the things she needs to do to physically take care of herself. And she'll point out the same thing in the disability space in terms of something's wrong with her. And that doesn't mean that she doesn't deserve dignity. And we're so thankful that our society will accommodate that and allow her to thrive anyways. But to ignore that something is wrong, that something in her body is not functioning the way it's supposed to function, doesn't help. And I think that's where I disagree with much of where the trans narrative has gone. And a lot of these policies are structured around that assumption that this is just identity, that if you want to paint your bedroom green, you should be able to paint your bedroom green. And if you want to go on estrogen, you should be able to go on estrogen. And I don't think those are equivalent.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, another contentious thing that's part of this dialogue is drag queen story. I always spoke about this a couple of years ago with Buck Angel, and we were talking about it. And it just still to some extent, I agree with this, but I'm starting to shift more the other direction. What I said was, if a guy wants to dress in drag and go read to kids, I have no real issue with that. If what that guy is doing is reading to kids, okay, it's a man dressed as a woman. He's wearing a costume. They're little children. You can talk about it like that. He's an adult and he wants to dress like, sometimes on Halloween you dress up as a princess or a knight or whatever. Like you could just, you can use that analogy and you can talk about it. You can explain it in that way. And I thought that would be an innocent and a good way to introduce it to young children. And like, I wouldn't really have an issue with that. But now when you have the twerking and, slipping money in the garter belts and then you have little kids getting up on stage, I'm like, okay, I can't really defend you anymore. It's like you said, you've just gone way too far. So, in the same sense that you were talking about the policy that's coming from the conservative convention, Michelle Rempel Garner, I guess now, she was like, "Oh no," uh, she was out in defense of drag story hour and saying if you speak out against it, you're hateful, blah 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 blah. And this is a conservative politician. And I'm like, okay, there is a ground you can take that's not that everyone who speaks out against this is hateful, and that this is a great and wonderful thing because I'm sorry, the what we've been seeing in the last couple of years is going a litlittle too far, and I don't think it should be in front of children. Like it's like like what you're talking about the debate. That debate's gone into the best way I heard this explained was James Lindsay a few years back. He was talking about the centrifuge. Okay, so you said you were an engineering background, so centrifuge and chemistry. Right? You spin it, and it spins the things to either it separates them by taking either side, and that's what's been happening with the discourse. It's like start with the right, like go a little bit further to the right. The left goes a little bit further to the left, and it's just spinning and spinning and spinning, and these things are going further and further apart. So it's the two sides of this conversation have just okay, there is a ground we can talk on, right? There is a ground, and she's going contrary to policy that was set up by her party, which I mean, I think you should have the right to do that. I think politicians should don't be lockstep with your party, but at the same point, like, don't speak out of two sides of your mouth either. But like, so like, but I'm just concerned about things like that. There's, that is a thing where it's either okay, ban it all, or no, let all of it go. Where I'm like, okay, you could talk about a guy in a dress reading to kids, and you could, which I think shouldn't be a huge deal. But when you go into like, the simulated births and the twerking and the mock strip tease and the fake boobs that are like not covered up. I mean, it's just like, okay, where's the adult? Where are the adults? Yeah, the discourse around this, like a lot of things, has just gotten way too divisive and confrontational.
Absolutely. No, the drag queen story hour debate topic, whatever you want to call it, is one of the pieces I spoke up about first. I do a video series called A Lot of Thoughts, where I do these 5 minute sort of quick take segments exploring a matter. And I did Drag Queen Story Hour quite early in that series. I've actually done it 3 times because it keeps coming up. First, I was doing it from the point of view of what it is and where I think it's unhelpful. The narrative that often comes up is that this helps to expose children to queer identities. And I think unabashedly queer role models is the wording, the verbiage that was used by the creators of Drag Queen Storytime. And of course, we could debate whether or not young children should be exposed to that at all. But I've argued this from the point of view of, even if you do think that exposing children to diverse identities is essential and is something you should be doing, like what you described, I'm not convinced that Drag Queen Story Hour does that. I think it does something very different because these people are performative. I find it pretty offensive because a small child seeing that is going to see a drag queen. They're going to see someone who's a man, who identifies as a man, who presents things in this very over the top manner. And then they're going to see me and they're going to think that that is representative. And I'm like, this is not what gender dysphoria is. This is not what transition is. This is a show. This is a farce. And so I have concerns about it from that side to begin with. And then I think it was in July, we had a situation at Toronto District School Board where the pushback was now pushing for mandatory drag queen story time. There was some event in the school in June, and parents were upset, and so the school allowed them to opt out. And the LGBT advocacy groups came in and were pushing that that shouldn't be allowed because children need this exposure. And at that point, we're now combining the argument of being allowed to do this with the argument that everyone should have to experience this, and that's just a whole nother level of concern for me because I certainly would be opting my kids out if I was in that school. And well, I may not go so far as to say it should be banned. Nobody can do this because I don't like it. To not be allowed to opt out myself is a whole other
Yeah,
ballpark for me.
yeah, it's nuts. I mean, like, I don't want to focus on the drag queen stuff, but it's just like I said, it was just one of those things that you can point out how badly this has gone. And um, okay, so I had Mia Ashton on, and we were talking about this, and I said, okay, where is your middle ground on this, or where would you be comfortable with the line? So um, I used Blair White as an example. I said, okay, so if you're in a washroom in a bar, it's an adult setting, it's not kids, and Blair White walked in. Now, like, or even someone like yourself, like you're not self IDing, you're not Jessica Yanev, like, um, and, and so you've taken steps, and and I don't think, like, from everything I've read and like the people I've talked to, I don't think you're going to go in there and just proudly announce and like, like, okay, most people want to go into the washroom, do their business, and get the hell out. Like, like, it's, but the performative part of it, that's where it's so and what she said to me was that when she first started speaking about this, she was at that place where, okay, someone like Blair, fine, I don't mind it. The reaction she's gotten and the way she, like how extreme the other side's gotten, it's like I said, it's, and nothing against me. I think she's, I respect her at like her writing. I don't really have an issue with her. But she's just like, okay, well, they've gone that far. I'm going to go a little further this way. Right. So it's instead of, okay, maybe I can take a step in and try to bridge that gap. But I mean, obviously, you don't want to go too many steps in because then you're going too far. But I mean, like, there's got to be some sort of give, and so it's like I'm happy to talk about those kind of things. Like, there's got to be spaces where women have to be, like biological women. I don't think biological males should be allowed into women's prisons. Like that's one thing. Like that's a hill I'll die on. And I think also in sport, if you want to talk about fairness and how it's done, like I don't think Leah Thomas should be swimming, you know, in the women's category. I don't. And I'll even go so far as someone like Leah Thomas or Jessica Yaniv. I think they're doing it not because they're dysphoric. I think they're doing it to game the system because the way it's set up, it's easy to be gamed. And you know, I think they're men. Like that. Like, it just there comes a point where I think you have to be honest about it, and that's where I stand with those two. Like I'm not, like in every person I'm going to take on an individual basis because that's what you should do. But like someone like them, like that, like that's where I stand on that. So, but like I said, we have to have those kind of conversations. Like the sides are too far apart, but we need to start bringing them a little bit closer together.
Absolutely. No, I'm so happy that you got to talk to Mia. I saw that episode. I haven't listened to it yet, but she's a friend. I'll be seeing her next week. Um, I agree with what you said and how you kind of characterized that. And you described the moving further out. One side is going to this extreme. I'm going to reciprocate that on my side. And that is, I think, what we're seeing right now. Both ends of this contention look to the other side and say, well, look at how extreme those people over there are. And they're not wrong. They are as extreme as they're saying. So therefore, I'm justified in doing this. But we also know that this is not how we find workability, right? This is the opposite of that as we each move to those extremes. I try to take a pragmatic approach. I with the work that I do and with the articles that I write, I'm privileged to be able to speak to a lot of leadership in our various provincial governments and in our federal government. So I get to have a lot of these conversations with politicians and somebody very high up in the CPC, so in the Conservative Party. When I was talking to them, they said, "But what does this all mean from a policy perspective?" And it was a kind of a wake up moment for me. And this was a few weeks ago, and I'm chatting about some of the stuff that I'm seeing on both sides, the extremism, the moderation, the way that I see the lay of the land. And this individual kind of kept steering me back to say, but what does this mean from a policy perspective? Because in the end of the day, that's all that matters. When it comes to sex-based spaces, like the washroom stuff you mentioned there, you can't actually regulate Blair White out of a woman's washroom because Blair White is one of the most passable trans women that exists. And just to define that for anybody who doesn't know what I mean that her appearance is very convincingly feminine. Her voice is very convincingly feminine. You're not going to know unless you have access to government records to verify or you're seeing her naked. And so if she walks into that washroom and you don't specifically know Blair White to know who that is, then you're never going to have any idea that this is a biological man. And so from a policy point of view, you can't actually do anything to stop that individual from entering because when we say something should be sex based, what we're really saying is it should be the appearance of sex based. It should only be for people who the average person feels like is a biological female. Now that's not true for all of them. Obviously, something like a prison, we know who you are when you're in prison, so that's a different question. But that for me taps into what you were describing of the nuance. I did take a position against the conservative resolutions, but I took that position because of the lack of nuance in what came out there. I also agree with you when you say that there are spaces and there are places where we are not balanced and we need to find balance in the name of safety or in the name of fairness. However, a resolution that comes down and says all spaces should be, or all of these spaces, along with et cetera, because the resolutions had, et cetera at the end of them, should be sex based without defining how we determine what a sex-based space is, what the criterion is to justify it. That's concerning to me because it doesn't really have any bound. So I can appreciate what they're going for, and there's parts of it that I would support, but when it's done with such a broad stroke, I certainly do take pause.
Yeah, and I mean, okay, so getting back, like I said, my thing, the kids. So I was speaking to someone yesterday. It was about the Million March for Kids, and one of the things I said was like, first of all, I don't think little children should be brought up to be confused. There was a case in Ottawa where a little girl said she was all the way female, and her teacher said that's ridiculous. There's no such thing. No one's like that, and started berating her in front of her class. Or with that, so my concern with this is where I think like definitely need some policy. We need a lot better guidance from the government, and we need a lot, you know, when they're saying hide everything from the parents. Okay. Oh, and they're making parents guilty and they have to prove their innocence. Like instead of, okay, you're innocent until proven guilty. And I don't want to be callous and I don't want to be, oh, unfeeling or whatever. No, I don't want some kid beaten up or killed by the parents before something's done. Like I don't want that. But you can't just automatically assume that all parents are going to start doing that to their children. Like it's not a good way for a school system to be working. You should work with the parents, not like be in confrontation. So, but you could have a happy medium where if a kid comes up to a counselor and says, "Look, I'm having these feelings. I think I might be trans or I might be gay or whatever," right? And goes to the counselor. But if I say this at home, my parents are going to do something, and you could have, let's say, a 72-hour window, or if you want to do more, like a week-long window or something, where the child is assessed and you speak to counselors, and I know you can't do a proper assessment, but at least they can talk to them, you know go to child protective services or whatever, and have the kid looked at, and then you can go talk to the parents. Like, you don't have to take the kid out of the home. You can have interviews at school, blah blah blah. You can do that, and the kid can go home and just be quiet for those few days or that week or so. But to have it indefinite and to have, like, it was just with the school union thing, like with this march going on, some of the school boards put out a thing where if the kids wanted to speak to the press, they had to get parental approval. But I'm like, but you're going to put them on, Joe, hormone therapy and puberty blockers and give a girl a chest binder without parental notification? Like, they're the two things don't sit. So that's, what, again, with that, I think there is a way you can find a medium because, look, I come from a Muslim background. I know how, the feelings in Islam towards like gays and lesbians. And depending if you're in Iran or Pakistan, I mean, the transgender thing also, they're like, transgender people are not generally accepted. I mean, Pakistan and Iran, it's like they either change your sex or we'll kill you. I mean, it's a different story. But so I don't want kids, again, I don't want kids to be in danger. But at the same time, I don't see how you can keep parents out of this question. It's, you know, to push back to parents trying to find out what's going on with their kids. I mean, to me, that's crazy.
One of the frustrating things I found in the conversations that are going on is that there is so much happening at once. And if you are very invested in this conversation and you're reading everything, then you understand how the pieces all fit together. But for many people, they're looking at this with a cursory view. They read the occasional news article, but they don't necessarily see how many pieces are at play. Um, the childhood social transition piece, I know you touched on there in terms of most school boards in Ontario or in Canada not including parents if a child wants to transition in school. So a kid comes and says, as you described, I feel trans, I feel like a girl, I want to go by Julia and she, her. The school will do that, and the school will actively not tell the parents unless the kid wants to tell the parents. They will start using that name. All the classmates will know, the other teachers will know, but the teachers in the office will also know that they shouldn't use this name when the parents are around because those parents don't know. That is abhorrent to me as a parent and as someone who's gone through a social transition and understands both the powerful positive effect it can have on someone who's dysphoric, but also the way that it interplays with the relationships of the people you haven't told, the other psychosocial underpinnings that can exist that, aren't being kind of reviewed and sussed out in the process. Like, that's terrifying to me. And I take a very strong stance against that. I think that it is critical that parents are at minimum informed. There's the debate between should parents know about this or should parents have jurisdiction over saying yes or no. That's complex. I don't know precisely where I stand on that in some of the nuances, but definitely they should know. The idea that this should happen behind their back and they shouldn't know about it, for me, there is no debate. At the same time, there's also the conversations of what you mentioned there, which is the medical transition. I have yet to hear of a case of a medical intervention for a child in Canada that wasn't with the parents' knowledge. There absolutely have been cases of medical intervention without the parents' consent. Um, and the medical piece of it is where really where the article that I wrote most recently for National Post steers the conversation. I want to avoid the medicalization of transgender matters for children. Full stop. That is my position. That is what I would like to have. However, I am really concerned about the conversation that's being had because there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in the why people want to do this behind it. They look at childhood transition and they say there's tons of concerns. There's health concerns. There's concerns of regret, and those are all true. Those are all true. I stand by that, and those are wonderful reasons not to move forward. There's my daughter has talked about getting a tattoo on several occasions or a septum piercing, and I've said no to all of these things because those are body modifications that she might regret. And there's nothing stopping her from doing that when she's 20 or when she's 21. And she might regret it then, but she's an adult. However, there's no reason in my mind to do that when she's younger. She might fit in with a certain crowd who's into that sort of thing, but there's just no reason to move forward with something like that she might regret. These interventions are much larger than a tattoo or a piercing. So in that sense, I do have great concern with how we're handling medical transition. The piece of the puzzle, though, that I'm really discouraged is not being talked about is why is someone drawn to this? What is the argument to put a 10-year-old on Lupron and then put them on to estradiol by the time that they are 13? And that is all about passability. That is all about the fact that a child has not yet gone through puberty. And if you put them on blockers and if you put them on cross-sex hormones, they'll be a Blair White. They're going to grow up for the most part to pass, to convince everybody on a cursory glance that they are the sex that they identify as. And they know that that will make their life much easier to live as that sex. If instead we say, no, you should wait till you're 18, or some professionals say 25, until your prefrontal cortex is fully developed. And at that point, you can transition, especially for the biological males like myself. You are almost guaranteed not to pass in society. Your voice will have lowered, and that is not going to change on estrogen. Your jawline here is going to have kind of got its sharp look. The brow here, the height, all of these things are not going to change. Estrogen will grow breasts. Estrogen will soften your tone. Estrogen will lead to hair loss around your body, but it's not going to change all of these major markers that define sex for us. And the part that I think needs to be acknowledged is there is a huge implication on that. We often talk as though we live in a genderless, we live in a society that has gotten rid of the imperatives of gender. And when people point at this, they usually point towards biological women. They point towards where we were 100 years ago with women's suffrage, where we have come, the rights that have been gained, the equality that has been attained. And what I think is often ignored is where we still have to go with that, how deeply gendered so many aspects of our society remains. You mentioned earlier here when we were chatting about kids and dysphoria coming out of puberty. I disagree with that because I certainly was dysphoric before puberty. However, it's not about the genitals. I did not like my penis. I sat there with scissors when I was 8 years old in the washroom and thought maybe I should cut this off. I wanted to get rid of it, but it was because of what I knew it meant. It was because I wasn't allowed to play with the girls. I had cooties because I was a boy. I was isolated at school. All of these social structures that reinforced I didn't belong, I knew was all because I had a penis. And so that's why I wanted to get rid of the penis. It wasn't actually because the body part itself, the physiology of it caused me stress and anxiety directly. So my belief is that if we can do a better job of not having everything so gendered, that is a wonderful way to handle dysphoria and justify why we don't need to take medical intervention at any sort of a young age.
Okay, like about like I said, when I said that about the dysphoria, that was just meeting, I guess there, and I can understand what you're saying. Like, yes, little boys and little girls don't play together. It's just they kind of like boys have cooties and girls are gross, or who knows, like it's just you do have that. I get it. And I understand what you're saying with that. But when you're saying the understanding the why, again, I go back to like how corrupted our institutions. Answering that why question now is becoming harder and harder. So when a kid goes in and says, let's take an extreme, like, okay, I've got suicidation. Oh, well, that's because your gender is not being affirmed. So you're not looking into why the kid's being suicidal. It's, and again, this is just outsider looking in, reading stuff, seeing what's going on, or talking to a few people, and that to me, that's how it seems like. Oh, you've got suicidal thoughts. It must be because you're not being affirmed in your gender. Let's start transitioning you, and that'll fix a suicide. So I keep using this a lot lately because I think it's very relevant. Hitchens used to talk about this. It was from Man from All Seasons, and there's the the English, I don't know, the Church of England's like chief inquisitor or whatever. He's talking to Thomas More, and Thomas More said, like, oh, so you'd cut down the law to get a hold of the devil, and he's like, yeah, I'd cut down every single law, and I have to. It's like, then what are you going to do when the devil turns around and faces you? You've got nowhere left to hide. I'm like, that's what quote unquote the woke left has done. Our institutions are so denuded of any of their faculties that when you have an overcorrection coming from the other side, you don't have any defense left. So, you ask like the why. Yes, the why is very important. Why do you think you're the opposite sex? Why do you think, this? But when the side that's pro this has gotten rid of that question on their own, and it says just must be this, like you've now lost the ability to ask and answer that question. And that's why there's where a lot of my trepidation in this comes from. It's like, do we even? Okay, I know there's people like in Canada. There's Robert Cantor, I believe, and then there's Sasha Ayad in the States, and I know
James Cantor and Sasha
James
Ayad, yeah.
Cantor. Yeah. Okay, so there are, and I know there are others, but we don't have an abundance of therapists who are actually looking at this, reasonably and saying, okay, yeah, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Let's discuss it. Let's find out. Instead of, no, you don't. That's impossible. Or yes, you do. Let's start affirming you, and we'll get you on the road to medical transition. Whatever. Like like again, there is no middle ground there. And the reason since I got back from overseas that I'm coming focused on the left, I'm like, you've got to control a lot of these institutions, and you're tearing them apart. And now we're at a point where we actually need these, and we don't have it. So I'm really concerned about the why question. Do we have the capacity left to answer that why question?
I approach this from the policy side of things in terms of I agree with that. I agree that the way we're doing therapy, the way we're doing medical childhood malehood transition, that needs to stop. That is a problem. And I've always felt like I occupy this weird middle space because I am transgender and I have spent and continue to spend considerable time deeply within progressive circles. And at the same time, I have these concerns. And for the last 18 months, I have spent most of my time within gender critical or social conservative circles. And the way everything is framed, the way they talk about everything is entirely different. A video came out yesterday that showed the Ontario Federation of Labor meeting about the protest coming up this week. And I watched through that, and I've talked to a number of people about what they saw, and people are shocked to hear the language and the way that it's spoken. But to me, this was normal because I'm in these two different circles, and it's like, yeah, that is how the far progressive left speak. And when you're over talking with the conservative right, they speak entirely differently. And I feel like I have to, go back and forth and code switch and speak differently depending on who I'm talking to. Not to convince them that I agree with them, but just to even have them understand me. Be like, if I'm talking to this side, I have to say gender identity. If I say gender ideology, wow, I just sent a bunch of signals to them. But if I'm talking to this side, I've got to say gender ideology, because if I say gender identity, I sent a bunch of different signals to them. And it's learning how differently people are conceiving of this space. And so from the policy side of it, I look at these resolutions and I say, how is that going to be received by the general Canadian who hears that? Not the people who are at the convention, not the delegates, not the MPs, but how is the general Canadian going to hear that? Because we know what the talking point is going to be from the progressive left. This is anti-transgender. These people truly want to eradicate you. I get this every day. People say, Julia, they want to eradicate you. And like you said, once you've helped them get rid of childhood social transition and some of these things, they're going to come right for you and they're going to, eradicate your existence. And so that's the point that's going to come at them. And so the question for me is how is it defended? How does one show that this is not anti-transgender? That the values you communicated in this conversation that really is the underpinning. People want adults to be able to express the way they want. People want everyone to thrive, but they're genuinely only worried about the concerns that come from childhood medical transition. And for me, that's why that second piece of the conversation needs to be present, because to ignore the why, people so desperately cling on to this, and to just say, we should ban this because it's risky, and kind of, ignore the rest of the conversation, it sends a strong signal. Well, if you look at the other resolution, the sex-based space one, same thing. There was an interview that was done with Linda Blade at the convention there, and I watched it online. And the interviewer asked her whether or not this was anti-transgender, because clearly that's how it's going to be framed by certain people. And the response is, no, this is not anti-transgender. This is pro-women. And the reality that we all kind of know is that something can be two things at once. Something could be pro-woman and anti-transgender, and that's how the other side's going to see it, as anti-transgender. This side sees it pro-woman. Okay, so how do we get to a place where we can actually move real policy forward? I believe that is to confront both of those, to say, well, maybe it has pieces of both. How do we reconcile that, and how do we move forward in a way that we can get a majority to align with it and actually solve the root problems we want to solve? In short, if we really want to avoid the risks of childhood medical transition, which I do, okay, well, then how are we going to create a situation where there is less need for it? Because if you just abolish it, if you ignore the desperation I felt as a kid that made me so desperately want that, and just say, no, you can't have it, how do we expect that to be a long-term and infinite solution, right? It might be a finite solution as long as that policy stands, but the pushback will come. It will flip back again, and I don't see that as solving the root issue.
Yeah, no, okay, like with the childhood thing, so Bill C4, it's affirmation only, or if the conservatives say we're going to get rid of all affirmation therapy, that needs to be looked at, because there are going to be some kids who, okay, we won't medically transition you, but if you want to dress as a girl and act as a girl, if you want to dress as a boy, act as a boy, it's fine. We'll help you along. And then as you get older, if this continues and you feel those needs, then they can look at if you want to advance with medication, whatever. But starting but if the conservatives say we're going to get rid of all affirmation therapy, and the liberals say no, it's affirmation only, those both two sides are wrong, as far as I'm concerned. It's just, okay, it's like the debate around schools. The conversation should not be whether we have, whether the Peel District banned books or whether DeSantis is banning books, okay, because I'm a free speech advocate, it's the only thing I'm an absolutist about. But even at that point, for the same reason I don't say what's going on in Florida and other states is banning, it's more of a curation. And the Peel District School Board did the same thing, that they're curating it, whereas this is coming from the parents, that's coming from the top down. You can look at the arguments of why they're trying to curate those books. But the bigger problem is, what was the thing that just came out about Ontario? 60% of kids can't do math at grade level. Kids aren't reading properly. I don't really care what, it doesn't really matter what books are in the library if the kids can't read. That's the bigger question. So the affirmation only or no affirmation at all, well, you are going to miss kids who do have some serious problems, and it's going to go on. Now, I think there is a way to deal with this, and maybe I'm being naive, and maybe I totally out of my depth, but I think there is a way where you can speak to kids who do have dysphoria or do have these feelings without having to get them on a course of lifelong medical treatments. And you can let them kind of develop normally, and quote unquote normally, but like the way, or if you want to say biologically, I don't like, it's just words have lost meaning, so it's hard to express things.
I agree with you. The statement you said there, that you think there's a way that we can kind of work with these kids in a not affirmative only model and create workability for them without medical transition. Yes, I agree with you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And this is why I look at those two conservative resolutions together, not in isolation. If just the medical childhood medical transition resolution would move forward into policy, okay, I would actually support that. But when that one moves forward in conjunction with the sex-based spaces one, that's where I say, okay, take a step back a moment. One thing I said in my article for National Post was look at something like washrooms or look at something like sports. We act in this conversation as though washrooms are a place to, you know, to pee, and sports are about competition. And those are not untrue statements. However, washrooms are about way more than peeing. Anybody who spends time in a school knows that washrooms are a clubhouse where you hide out from people during a game of tag. Washrooms are a refuge where you go to get away from your teacher during class so that you can talk. And now washrooms are a place where you vape and you socialize and you do all of those things. Sports, same thing. Sports are competition, but your high school team sport is also a friend circle. It's a community. It's camaraderie. It is all of these other things as well. I'm okay with saying it's not fair that a biological man can win a competition like swimming, like you mentioned. That's not fair. I agree, it's not fair. We should do something about that. However, that doesn't equate with a gender dysphoric child like myself saying, I look at it this way. I saw 4 counselors before I was in grade 7 because my life didn't work and everybody knew it. And I come from an evangelical Christian household. This was the 90s. So all of them were Christian counselors. Nobody once ever mentioned anything about maybe I was gay, maybe I was, trans. No one touched it. It was all just, how are we going to find Jason friends? And what was the solution? We'll buy Jason a basketball net because maybe then Jason can learn to play basketball and then Jason will, get along with the boys at school. And the given solution was Jason has to learn how to fit in to the male social circles. So we're going to do the things. We're going to go out and play catch. We're going to try to get Jason to watch hockey with his dad, all the things to try to get me to fit into that space because I grew up in a small rural farming community in Ontario. There wasn't anything else. It was get along with the boys or don't have friends because the girls were in brownies. The girls were in their own spaces that I couldn't access. And so that's kind of my criticism here is if we have a non-affirmation only model of therapy, what is that counselor actually going to say to the truly gender dysphoric child? Not the children who fall into this, which I know is most of them who are following an identity and following their friends. That's a whole different situation. We absolutely should be working with those kids and helping them to not have to fall into an identity such as this. But for the truly gender dysphoric ones, for the Jasons, for the little me, what are we going to say to them when Jason says, but the people who I was friends with, the people who I understand, I am falling away from because they spend all of their time in grade 7 volleyball together and I am not allowed to be there because I have a penis. My penis has to go. They're going to say, well, your penis doesn't have to go. And you don't need those friends. You can find other friends. You know what I mean? As long as we enforce those spaces, if we enforce the spaces based on the biology, that creates the problem. If we don't enforce the spaces based on the biology, then okay. Does that make sense? Kind of how they interplay in a certain respect?
If it comes down to competitions, right, like that's where I'm like, okay, Leah Thomas again. As a man, it's like 200th or 400th in swimming, and then wins the women's. There's an issue there, and then it's not just Leah Thomas. There's like one after another after another. Okay, breaking women's records, and okay, where did you stand as a man? That I have an issue with. Now, what you're talking about, like in school, if it's in gym class or if it's intramural leagues, again, I really want to talk about that because I don't know if I don't want to say yes or no in like intramural leagues or like pee-wee leagues or anything like that because even at young ages, again, from things I've been reading, boys will have a slight advantage athletically. It doesn't mean that every boy will be better than every girl, and every girl will be not as good as every boy. Obviously there's outliers everywhere, but I think you can make spaces where okay, everyone's allowed to come play volleyball and you can play with your friends or like an extra thing. Like I'm again trying to find a happy medium because I do think in certain things, like let's say there's a girl who's fair to middling in a sport, but she's got potential and she could really do well, and then there's one or two boys who feels dysphoric and they're allowed to play on that, but because of their biology they're playing better than that girl, and it disenfranchises that girl. She loses interest in that because I'm not as good, I'm never going to be as good. It's the whole thing. there's a detriment there too. So I think like when you look at that, you have to really look at is this for competition? Is this for fun? Like okay, little kid sports should always be for fun. Let's I don't want to I don't want to be like sound like one of those parents or whatever. But
Yeah,
I mean like if you do have competitive teams as opposed to if you have a school fun thing like an intramural like lunchtime ball hockey league or volleyball league or whatever like just it's more or less for fun inside the school and they might find
yeah.
good players. So I think again, you have to have that conversation of how you want to go about doing this. Like, fairness should come into play in some aspect of it as well.
And that's, I think you and I are on the same page with this one in terms of kindergarten soccer league. That is for fun. That is about fun.
Yeah.
That is not about competition. If you're a parent who's deeply concerned and enraged that your kindergarten child was like disadvantaged, that's a problem. So that's about fun. Leah Thomas rally games, that is about competition. That's not about being friends with your competitors, having that. That is about being a world class competitive circle. I agree. At the fun end of the spectrum, why do we make sex matter whatsoever? At the deeply competitive end, it matters immensely. I don't know where the division is. I don't know where the cutover point is in between there. I believe it needs to be defined though. That to say that a kindergarten boy can't play on a girls' soccer team for any reason is a little bit excessive. To let Riley Gaines compete against Leah Thomas in international swimming competitions, that's ridiculous.
Like, I think we need to get this conversation back into the middle. And okay, no one's really helping here. So when New Brunswick said, okay, we're not going to allow schools to, do this behind the parents' backs, and right away Trudeau was like, oh, well, the parental rights movement is a far right movement. I'm like, do you really think it's a good strategy politically? Like, even like you're talking about, okay, we wanted to look at this from a policy point of view or whatever. Like, does he honestly think that picking a fight with parents is a right political strategy to be going forward with? I mean,
It's a horrible strategy. This is something I'm writing about currently for an upcoming article. Is that branding everything that touches on anything to do with transgender, matters and where maybe there's some overreach as anti-transgender does not help the liberal cause. It hurts the liberal cause immensely because 80% of parents say, I want to know if my kid is socially transitioning. I back that. And if you start to create a narrative where 80% of Canadians are, lambasted as anti-transgender, then you're normalizing anti-transgenderism in that respect. And I guess that's the default position of most of us. And that that does not help what they're trying to achieve.
okay. Something you said there, and I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know you're probably busy. So, but maybe we could finish on this. So when I first got back from overseas, the first two things I thought of, um, one was a quote from Milton from Paradise Lost, and it was, "Ask the devil stood and felt how awful goodness is." I mean, like, it goes on a little bit, but it's just like, okay, I was looking at what was going on in the name of fighting racism or, fighting hate or whatever. Like, you guys are making goodness awful. And the other thing was from Shakespeare, and it's his long soliloquy that Richard the Third does, and he talks about how he's going to be so evil, and he's like, and I'll set the murderous Machiavel to school. And I'm like, okay, and I'm like, you guys are going to get over it. You're going so far to like one side, like you're making goodness awful that these other people are sitting here going, okay, yeah, wait until I get into power and I'll show you, what authoritarianism is. I'll show you, what like fascism, whatever. Like, I'll show you like how strident I can be. And it's so when you've got Trudeau saying that, and you've got all these people saying, okay, if it's either I got to support trans rights or I got to protect my children. So most parents are going to protect their children, and you know there is going to be that backlash. Like I, take the race stuff uh, in a so Canada's what 70% white. I don't know. I can't remember the figures right now, but when you have conferences like Brown complicity and white supremacy about how brown people are complicit in white supremacy, and this is being put on by the editor of the Toronto Star, one of the heads of the largest school boards in Ontario, and like I can't remember who the other two people were. When you've got things like Asians are white adjacent or Jews have white privilege. So when you live in a country that's 70% white, don't you think you should like coalesce all the different minorities together instead of trying to divide them even more? Like if I was in the States and I was David Duke, I'd be cheering them on. Like, go ahead, yeah, split each other up. Like, it's divide and conquer. And so there's they're breaking apart everything that protects us, and at the same point, you're making these, you know, giving people these two choices where it's almost like they want a race war. It's almost like they want violence against trans people to happen so they can say, "Look, see, we told you we were right." Like it's almost like they want that, and it's I from when I first came back, the biggest thing I was worried about was overcorrections, and I was worried about will we have the institutions left to protect us, and now it seems like we don't, and now it seems like we are getting overcorrection.
I agree with your characterization of the far left. I'm in a special spot because I am transgender, which means the far right will not embrace me. And I speak critically of the trans rights activists, which means the far left will not embrace me. So I get to see kind of the extreme and very clearly on both of these ends. And I think you've done an accurate job there of characterizing the one side of it. I always try to remember though that there is an extreme, an equivalent extreme on the other side
Mm,
as well, right? There is that extreme who really does want to eradicate transgender people. And this is what this is why these sides can't talk, right? Because when Trudeau speaks, he's speaking about people who exist, but he's making it sound like it's everybody who has gender critical concerns when really it's the 2% on the far end of it. And then when the gender criticals speak about the progressive left, they speak towards the 2% extreme on that side. Most Canadians, I believe, from my experience in talking to tens of thousands of people in all of these circles, is most people, want the Canada that we still have, that is slipping from us, but that we still have and have had for a long time, which is a place of acceptance, a place of tolerance, a place of embrace. Most Canadians do not want trans eradication. Most Canadians do not want the state to interfere with their ability to raise their child and to control the ideologies they're exposed to. And for me, talking to people on both of these sides, I feel like that middle ground does exist. And my fear is the overcorrection, just like you described, of as people ever pit in one direction or the other. I don't want to see the overcorrection for the current. We've had a progressive left government for 8 years in Canada, and that certainly has swung policy wise in a direction that I'm not comfortable with, and many people who have gender critical concerns are not comfortable with. I want to see correction. I don't want to see a swing back to the point that it goes just as unbalanced in the towards bona fide anti-transgender sentiments. And I use that term carefully because I know that the far left will call anything that speaks critically of anything about transgender matters anti-trans. I mean true anti-trans stuff that really is designed to actually, kind of eradicate or prevent people from living a transgender lifestyle. I want to see that middle. I want to see something that reflects, kind of our core Canadian values. And I believe that's possible because as I talk to people in these movements, there is extremism, but it's not most people. I talk to parents every single day who are going to be attending the march this coming Wednesday, and they're not extremists. They're normal people who love transgender people like me and are concerned about what their kids are being taught. And to me, that gives me hope that there is a middle place that we can eventually land upon.
yeah, okay. I mean, about the rights, I've always started speaking out about the left, and it's not like I ever never paid attention to the right. Like before I went away overseas, I would say, look at these nuts, look at these nut bars, like the far right. But I mean, I left Canada in 2002. I came back in 2014, and it was such a difference. And I mean, it was for me, it was like culture shock. Like I can only describe myself like the frog thrown in the pot of boiling water, freaking out, whereas the other frogs are just kind of, oh, this feels great. It's like, okay, don't you see how nuts we've got? And so my thing was, okay, I always considered myself like center left, like I was gay marriage, abortion, but not until the moment of the kid's crowning. Like uh, things like that. Like you could probably find me on the same side as like left leaning positions, but I was never I wasn't like full on socialist or even like I could see cutting some social programs and stuff like not getting rid of them, but cutting some of the funding, whatever. But then I come back and I'm like, okay, I want to fix my side. My side's broken. I see problems on my side. Like I do see problems on the other side, but again, this is being pointed out where when the far like so when you have a Charlottesville or when you have like people in white hoods, everyone knows when you've gone too far. But you don't seem to have that buffer on the left where it's now people are starting to like when it started getting touching children, people are like, okay, no, you're touching children, that's a problem. Okay, like the racism stuff, you know, professor at Cambridge who said I want to abolish whiteness and I want to, I can't remember her exact wording, but she was talking about violence against white people. She got tenure at Cambridge after she said that. You know, the leader of BLM in Toronto, were her exact phrasing, did I wake up every morning praying to Allah that I don't kill some old white man? You know, uh, like, and I can point out more and more stuff like this. I mean, videos of people like I mean, they're posting themselves. Like, it's not someone else taking the video and posting it. Like, they're videoing themselves and they're posting it about how it's their right to like kill white people or whatever. Looking what's going on in South Africa, like the song "Kill the Boer," right? There's always defense for stuff like that, and there's never been curtailed. So I'm like, so my thought was, especially when I first got back, I'll try to fix, quote unquote, my side, and hopefully there's people on the center right that are going to turn around and rein in their crazies. Like we always had a defense against crazy, but again, I keep going back to it. Like that defense has been overrun and it's become ideological, so we no longer have that. So, okay, the anti-Semitism thing. So when a bunch of pro-Palestinian protesters, and some of them were Palestinian, some of them were other Arabs, start chasing Jews down the streets of Montreal and Toronto, and Trudeau's first reaction is, oh, "Please be careful and don't be too Islamophobic. There's a problem." Okay, that gives a signal to the far right nuts that it's open season on Jews because they're no longer a protected class. You know, like I'm not saying that before that they would have been concerned about attacking a Jewish person or something like that. But now they'll feel more, they'll feel more confident and feel more empowered to say, you know, whatever, you control the media, or just going like, just going crazy and going nutty on the anti-Semitic stuff. So that's why I kind of focus on the left. Like, trust me, I can point out all kinds of things on the right, the nutty stuff. But to a point, there's like, okay, we're opposed to that. There's a like kind of like a hard line, and unfortunately, when I talk about the overcorrections, I think that hard line is being crumbled, and that's what scares me. So look, I know I said I don't want to keep you too long, so I'll give you the last word here if you want to respond to that, and also please let people know where they can get a hold of you, and I'll put the links in the description.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think everything you said there was well said. I personally try to focus more on what I stand for than what I don't stand for. And I'm not saying
Yeah.
that in opposition to what you've described, but that has been my approach, has been to say what does this middle ground look like? What does policy look like that protects the dignity and the rights of transgender individuals and recognizes that they have that they fit within a larger society that has a whole range of views and a whole range of other interests. And that's the conversations I'm trying to have. That's where I'm trying to look towards. And in the particular piece from this past week, I write for a conservative newspaper. So kind of how you described, you're trying to work on the left. My audience, for better or for worse, is that right audience. And for me, I view that as a privilege. That's an area that I can reach. There's very, very few trans voices in that space. So much of what I am preparing is targeted towards that audience, not everything, because I really am trying to work towards that moderate position as well. But yeah, no, this has been fun though. Thanks for inviting me on for this chat. You've asked where I can be found. So on pretty much every social platform, I am Alada Malata, which is a pun that I thought was hilarious the day that I came up with that. And yeah, I make a video series called A Lot of Thoughts with Julia Mallot, where I discuss these matters through 5-minute video segments, and I write a weekly piece for the National Post.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. It was great talking to you. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy this conversation. Like I said, I think we're in agreement a lot more than we disagree on. And I think we need to start having more of these. So thank you very much again for coming on. It was great. And
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
thanks everyone for listening. I'll be back.